Raise your hand if you've ever been driven in an Uber before. Great. If you have any feedback, feature requests, Haider's your guy. No, in all seriousness, though, Haider oversees the engineering for the driver team, actually. So the way the driver engages with the app, and I'll let him talk more about it, but Haider leads the engineering team around the world for that. How many of you have had some similar experience to this where maybe you're on a work trip or on vacation, and you get off the plane and you're exhausted, and you have to rent a car, so you go to the rental car place and you have to wait in line, and you're really tired because it's like, late at night when you just arrived, and then you're having this debate where like you want to be comfortable, but you want to spend a lot of money, and so you decide to go cheap, and you're in like this tiny car with your family. How many of those had those experience? Yeah, I have a solution for you guys. Andre is CEO of Turo. Or actually, I just heard a more fun use case for Turo. It is, maybe I shouldn't, it's TMI, but Tasneem said, we bought a car we couldn't afford, so we used Turo to help pay for it.
Yeah, we have a lot of those.
May is CEO of Cordoba, has an amazing story. Also, she just told me she's speaking at the SaaStr conference coming up in a couple of weeks. People pay like thousands of dollars to go to that conference, so you guys got a discount because you get to see May speak here. I'll start with brief introductions. You can tell us a little bit about your company, but also give us some of your background, kind of what we were doing beforehand, and how you came to be where you are.
Thank you, Mehdi. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. A little bit about me. I grew up in Southern California. I got my degree in computer science at UCLA, and I worked for various different software companies down there until I got the itch to join the startup world, and I got a great opportunity to work with a serial entrepreneur, Omar Hamawi, who had started AdMob and had an exit. He decided to create an incubator, and I was able to join that. We tinkered for a couple of years, and then eventually we spun out a company that didn't get that product market fit that all of you are seeking. Eventually, we ended up being acquired by LinkedIn. It was a good outcome for us. And then, I think there was somebody earlier who spoke about LinkedIn. I think it was Sammy, about like the culture and the pace, and I kind of felt that too. So 2 years after being there, I decided I needed to try something new, and I ended up joining Uber as a rocket ship, and it comes with all the turbulence that you'd expect from a rocket ship. So it's been exciting. Right now, I'm the head of engineering for the driver team. I manage an organization of 150 engineers in 3 sites. We're about to open up a 4th site in Amsterdam, which should be really, really exciting. I manage everything from the top of the funnel when drivers sign up. They go through background checks. We have to make sure they're compliant for every city and every regulation, which gets really complicated, all through the normal driving experience when they pick people up and drop you all off, and then how they cash out and they make their money. So the entirety of the life cycle of the driver partner for us. So that's what I'm currently doing.
My name is Andre Haddad. I'm the CEO of Turo. Super happy to be here, super excited to be part of this amazing event, and want to be part of the next events if I'm still invited after this panel. So I grew up in Beirut. I was born in the war-torn city, and I experienced war really firsthand because our place was roughly 250 meters away from the Green Line that separated East from West Beirut. I was lucky to be able to leave at one point. We left in '89 after a bomb shattered our house, and so we didn't have any reasons to stay anymore. And ended up by chance, really, and with, as Ali was saying, with the luck of meeting with wonderful people and tapping into just the natural generosity of humankind. Meeting with people who had a lot of influence in my moving to France first, and then what I did there. In a short summary, I spent 14 years in France. I started my first company there. It was one of the pioneering internet companies in Europe, a company called iBazaar. We were the very first online marketplace, and please note the bazaar in the name and the brand. It was literally the internet bazaar of the time. You know, you could buy and sell anything on that platform. And that started a love story that I've been with marketplace businesses for the last 20 years. Turo is another marketplace business. And at Turo, I've been at Turo for the last 7.5 years, so really scaled the business from a very, very small seed back in 2011 to where we are now. Hopefully, I'll be part of a panel where as many people raise their hands when the panel moderator says, "Have you experienced Turo?" As many as have experienced Uber. We're not there yet, but we're growing really fast. Last year, we ended up growing to a point where we're starting to reach real critical mass. We have 10 million users now, 300,000 plus cars that are listed on the platform. Unfortunately, no longer the M3, but there are some other M3s, maybe not the E63, but we have, last year we did 7 million booked days, so the business is getting really big. And primarily in the US, but we started expanding internationally, so excited to talk about international or anything else that you want to talk about.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Habib. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cordoba. We're a content intelligence platform. We sell software to enterprise and tech companies that helps them manage the content that's inside of their software products. We started the company in Dubai, which is why I think Mehdi invited me to this panel. It's also very nice to be here, by the way. It feels, TechWadi always feels like being with friends and family, which is a huge testament to the TechWadi leadership and what you guys have done with this. So I think you will be invited back, Andre. We are about 40 people, 30 of us are in San Francisco, a few still in Dubai, and the rest remote. We sell to VPs of product and engineering. How many folks here are in B2B, just for kind of the duration of the panel? Okay, so about a third, more B2C people, but cool. So we started in Dubai. We moved the business to San Francisco about 18 months later, about 3.5 years ago now. We've raised 20 million, about 3.5 of it from the region and the rest here. And so excited to dig into that topic as we get into the panel.
Well, maybe we'll start with you. Can you talk about how you started Cordoba, sort of the early days, what led you to start it? I think you've had an interesting background, and then also, you started it in Dubai, as you mentioned. What made you bring it to Silicon Valley?
Good questions. So my co-founder, Wasim, who's Syrian, we met in Dubai, and we had initially seen an opening in the localization space. The business has changed since then, but we left our jobs. I was working at a sovereign wealth fund, which is what had taken me from New York to Dubai, or Abu Dhabi then, to begin with. I'm Lebanese also by birth and background. And the reason we moved the business here was very quickly we saw, this was an enterprise play, this was an AI play, and it really came down to kind of the culture of customer development and product development. And although there are some really interesting, very large and complex businesses in MENA, the culture of working with startups to solve big B2B problems just doesn't exist. So it was really hard to get like Emirates' attention or Jumeirah's attention, really big companies and global companies. Whereas here, and it's really the Valley specifically, I don't think like other parts of the country are like this, but there is a real willingness and openness by key decision makers at big enterprise companies to work with startups because we are solving in a really agile way important business problems. And so we moved the business, and that was definitely the right instinct, although we did get pushback from investors who definitely wanted us to stay in the region, wanted us to be a regional story. They're very happy now. But the impetus really was, we wanted to solve really tough business problems. We now do natural language generation in English from scratch using AI for people like the NBA and PayPal, and that just was not what we had started the business to do, and I don't think we would have ended there had we stayed in Dubai. Not only because the scale and complexity of the business is different, but the culture of really engaging with startups to solve those problems. It's still very nascent, and we still have a lot of work to do. So that's why we ended up moving.
Andre, you talked about you guys had an amazing year. It sounds like you've had 7 million days booked on Turo. You know, Fred Wilson once wrote this blog post that I really like about, he said no to Airbnb, and he talked about how like it just sounded so crazy to him, and how he regretted though because he should have really realized these founders were amazing. He should have bet on the founders. Uber, I think, if you had asked people, you know, several years ago, is this company going to be, you know, take off? People would have been like, no, you know. I know, I'm sure you probably hate being compared to the Airbnb of this, or, right. But it's of a similar vein, and you guys seem to have had some significant growth. Can you talk about sort of what were the keys to that growth? You launched in, you know, you're not launching a local business, you're launching around the country and now around the world. Something that's a behavioral change for people.
Yeah, you know, similar to the Airbnb and Uber, sort of frankly similar to what most entrepreneurs would encounter, especially with investors, but also with family, friends, colleagues, and others, is the sort of incredulous nature of the idea at the beginning. And maybe a bit less in a B2B context when you talk to people who've experienced the issue and understand the opportunity, but just, you know, no one's done it yet. But in a consumer context, you know, there's always behind these very big success stories, whether it's Uber or Airbnb or Facebook or others, there's always a crazy concept, you know, a concept that I think most people would react to initially very skeptically. You know, I remember when I was raising money for my first company, iBazaar, back in the late 1990s. Obviously, the internet was a lot less developed back then. And when I told my parents I'm going to quit my job at P&G, which was a very important job because I was paying my student loan, I was paying it back thanks to my income from P&G for the first time. I was independent financially from my parents. They thought I was insane when I told them iBazaar is about letting strangers do online buying and selling, and they would then ship the item, and then they would receive a check by the mail. I had one of those moments where they looked at me and they literally, I think, thought I was insane. I had many of those moments with my parents, obviously, since then. But you know, it was not just them. It's you know, it is I think a general, you know, this idea back then, you know, back when there was, you know, the internet was very underdeveloped. You know, the idea that people would be able to, you know, buy and sell stuff around the world and would just send payments by the check. At that point, there was no PayPal, there was no credit card payments, there was no Stripe, there was no Braintree. None of that infrastructure existed. It's kind of crazy. Similarly with Turo, which is sort of where your question was, the idea of letting a stranger drive your car just seemed insane to many people. I mean, everyone knows how rental cars are treated by the drivers of these. You know, you come in, you're late, you have to stand in line, and then you end up with this car that you don't really like. And then you treat it like, you know, a commodity. You're not going to treat it with a lot of respect and with a lot of empathy. So the idea that people would be sharing their cars with others just seemed preposterous back in 2011. And of course, when you speak to investors, of course, they're all thinking about their M3s or their Jaguars or their Range Rovers, and they're like, I'm not letting anyone drive my car. I don't even let my children enter my car. So it's a particularly wrong audience, you know, to sort of come in with a concept like Turo. So it is very challenging to bring these crazy ideas. You got to be very passionate about the founding story of the company. And you know, obviously since then we've raised almost $250 million in venture capital over the last 7 years. It's a capital-intensive business. You know, you got to raise a lot of capital to build a marketplace business, not just the software, not just the cost of operating in Silicon Valley, but really, the marketplace only works when there's a lot of supply and there's a lot of demand, and there's a lot of that intervention to make sure that we match supply and demand in a very efficient way. So a lot of work needs to happen to get to that critical mass. A lot of marketing expenses go into it. A lot of software goes into it, and in our business, a lot of insurance goes into it. So, we are a risk management company behind the scenes. We effectively underwrite the risk of both the host and the guest. Without seeing the car, without meeting the guest, without knowing who the host is, we need to make sure that all three of these elements are great. And then if any of these fail, lots of costs end up being supported by us via our insurance policy. So a lot of incredulity as well with the insurance ecosystem. Imagine us going out and pitching large insurance companies and telling them, hey, would you like to underwrite peer-to-peer car sharing? My God, I've got so many meetings where people literally thought I was insane. And we got rejected by everyone. Everyone rejected us. On the insurance side. Finally, we're able to get one company that no one's ever heard of, a B2B player. Thankfully, they bet on us. Now, obviously, things have changed. Liberty Mutual, is our underwriter in the U.S. It's a big B2C, insurance company. Allianz in Europe, Intact in Canada. So now we have numbers, we have track records. So people now are more interested in the business. But in the early days, you got to have that belief. And you got to have that passion to convince all these naysayers that this crazy idea is actually going to work.
Haider, one of the things that obviously comes to mind is, so Uber now is virtually around the world, and especially a lot of folks here have traveled in the Middle East, especially, but also globally. Different places have different economies, different contexts. And the way transportation happens is different, and the way you do tipping and the way you pay drivers is very different. How do you think about that from a product perspective for such a global market?
Yeah, I think one of the aspirations for us on the customer side, on the rider side, is to make it a seamless experience where you press a button and you get a ride. Somebody shows up in 5 minutes and the payment is seamless to you. But what happens behind the scenes on the supply side is what my world is, and it's actually super complex. So, one aspect is the regulatory aspect. Every city in the world, I actually think that we don't have one marketplace at Uber. I think we have like 600 because every single city is a little bit different, and there's different rules that we have to abide by. Drivers have to abide by those different forms that we have to get. For example, in London, for a driver to be able to drive around all the boroughs in London, they have to gather documents from all these boroughs, and we have to consolidate this and bring this together and make sure all of them are legitimate and in compliant, and if they expire a day late, we have to remove this person from the platform. So, and send the notification so that this person is aware of it. Ultimately, these drivers are joining so they can make money, and it's an economic opportunity for folks, whether they're full-time or they're part-time. So we have to really be proactive in every single environment to adjust for that. When we approach product development, we try to build locally, or we try to build for a global option, but we are very cognizant that there are local conditions that are different. For example, you mentioned payment. In a significant part of the world, payment is through cash. And so, when Uber first started, we were all about this magical experience where you don't touch money and none of that happens. You come in and you leave and you don't even have to talk to the driver. That's how magical it was. But in places like India and places like Egypt, where cash was heavy and credit card penetration was low, we had to make a decision to introduce cash. When we introduced it, it created a lot of friction, not only in the app, in the car experience, but it also created a lot of friction around payments and arrears. So we had a situation where drivers had all this cash, and they had to return it so that Uber can take its cut. Where do they return it? How do we process that much money? Then a safety issue occurs, which we're dealing with in Brazil right now, where safety is a big issue. So we are actually in the process of thinking about how do we introduce features in Brazil that are more that are entirely different than places that are cash rich in India, where it's a lot more safe. So there are drivers in Brazil who would prefer to have a credit card enabled rider than a cash rider because they're afraid of holding cash. So how do we think about the product in these various markets, and how do we engineer it so our teams, our business teams across the world can really leverage? Another example, this is recent, relatively recent. I became really close friends with the general manager of our Egypt team over the course of the last couple of years. And so when we decided to rewrite the driver app, I wanted to pick 7 cities across the world where we would go and build the app with drivers. So we would actually, it was very confidential. We selected 500 drivers from 7 different cities, and we met with them on a regular basis. And so I chose Egypt because not only did I have a relationship with my friend there, but I wanted to bring it to the Arab world and use my influence to actually bring some of that status to that part of our global marketplace. So we went there and we spent hundreds of hours talking to drivers in Egypt, in Sao Paulo, in Jakarta, in India, in Los Angeles. But in Egypt, something that was very interesting was when we had built one feature, and I think the crowd will truly appreciate this, where you're in the driver app, and when the trip ends, it would show how much money you made on the screen. And we call this the earnings tracker, because drivers are making decisions, like if they hit their goal, they're gonna go offline and go home. And so before, you would have to end the trip, go offline, kind of go deep down inside of a bunch of screens to figure out how much money you made that day. Whereas drivers really want to understand it at that moment. So we designed it and we showed it to drivers. And one of the feedback that came in, it was hilarious to me because a bunch of drivers in Egypt were saying, no, this is Hassad. This will lead to Hassad. So I remember the research team is like, hey, what the heck is this thing called Hassad? And I was like, oh, I know what that is. And they're like, are you serious? I was like, yes, it's a big deal. They think about this stuff. So it became a big issue, a big meme in the company. And now it actually became hilarious because in our PR, all the PR that we were doing to roll out the app, similar questions happened. And Hassad became a term that everybody in my engineering team and beyond knows about now. So it was really fun. But we actually redesigned it because there was Hassad, fears of Hassad from Egyptian drivers. So examples of that were really, really fun. But there are myriad cases like this where in any market or any specific area, because of the business constraints or the compliance constraints or, technological constraints, we have to design around it. So yeah, it's really interesting.
May, one of the things I heard you talk about on a podcast, certainly the thing that sort of consumes at work most of my mental energy is how to get sales right. And you talked a lot about Cordoba's sort of journey and how much you've learned about sales. And could you talk a little bit about sort of how did you do it beforehand? What did you kind of learn to where you are now?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's another reason to be in the Valley if you're in B2B. The playbooks on sales here are so intense. You have to write your own, of course. And the thing that I think we've learned and do differently than most folks and differently than how we started doing it is really around everyone on our team being a product and use case expert, even the most junior who tend to be the folks who are pinging the market for some of the first conversations with prospects. They're called SDRs or sales development reps in most B2B companies. And we spend a lot of time training and ramping those people so that, if we've got a rep who is reaching out to Zillow, they're reaching out with, a specific use case of how Cordoba can help Zillow rewrite home descriptions. And actually, here's a screenshot. I already did it on this home, and check this out. And is this interesting for a further conversation? So it's a lot more in depth than, what 30-minute block works for you next week for, a call. That's a lot of work. And it's a lot of qualification, pre-qualification of who we think could really, get massive ROI from our product. It's more thoughtful, but there are also drawbacks to that. And so, companies that don't have a very large ACV, you guys don't have that problem, can't really sustain something that just takes a little bit longer and takes a bit more time. But, definitely, I think in B2B, the sales motion and getting that sales motion right it's the lifeblood of the company after product development.
Okay. We have 7 minutes left. Keep a timer. And I actually do want to open up so I'm going to ask one more question, then if you guys want to start brainstorming questions for the speakers as well. Andre, you sort of hinted at this, and I thought maybe the way you described it, talking about empathy might have been one of the keys, but could you go a little deeper about sort of how did you get trust in the system that people, will rent their cars out, and people are okay renting cars out themselves as well?
We struggled a lot with trust. The first incarnation of the business was very different from what it is today. We initially thought that trust was all about having a technology solution for everything. And so in the very early days of the company, we developed our own piece of hardware that we would invite every host that joins the marketplace to list their car to actually have to install in their vehicle to enable the whole